From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters.
You have to do it. It's either you do it or you go back to Jamaica.
I have a list of 23 workers. They're really afraid. There's extortion happening.
You've told them that you're concerned about the health and safety issue. What do?
They said to you that there's no danger.
Everybody keep their mouth closed.
Min Sook Lee's documentary, Migrant Dreams, gives us a glimpse into the in-between lives of Canada's migrant agricultural workers. But let's be honest, how much do we really know about the people who put food on our plates? Low-wage immigrant workers are a big part of Canada's agricultural workforce. More than 40,000 people come to Canada for seasonal agricultural work each year, most of them from Mexico, Jamaica, and Guatemala, and that is half the workforce putting the year-round fresh produce on our tables. With the threat of COVID-19, the livelihoods of people trying to help their families by growing our food are uncertain, and planting season is almost here. Without this essential labor, Canada's food security is at risk. Under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, low-wage migrants are tied to one job, one location, and one employer without any hope of belonging. And now they're caught in a pandemic. The government is allowing seasonal farm workers into the country, including a new $50 million program to help employers cover the costs of new self-isolation requirements for when workers arrive in Canada. But human rights advocates are raising the alarm. The safety measures won't work in the crowded living conditions these workers are forced to live in. This pandemic has highlighted what was already there, the plight of the thousands who have put food on Canadian tables without any chance at a real life here. They were unprotected even before an international health crisis. Today, we talk to the Star's work and wealth reporter Sara Mojtehedzadeh about what these migrants are facing. And she talks about her recent story about Jamaican migrant workers who are being forced to sign COVID-19 waivers, releasing their government of any liability. If they get sick, they're on their own. Sara, what kind of problems are migrant workers facing as a result of COVID-19? Are they even able to come and work here easily since the travel restrictions?
So the first problem that a lot of workers are facing is the inability to actually get out of their home countries. I spoke to a couple of workers in Trinidad this week who are on complete lockdown at home. They can't leave. They can't get their visas processed to come to Canada. And in the meantime, they have no income. The Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program is their main and often only source of income, and they're facing delays, they said, until potentially June. Many people who rely on this as a stream of income to support their family are not able to get out of the country right now. And many of them are hoping that having paid into Canada's employment insurance system for often decades, that they can access some of that money, which historically they have not been able to access. But, these are obviously really unprecedented times. And I think a lot of workers who we haven't traditionally thought about falling through the cracks, the pandemic is really exposing the ways in which they are losing income and losing the support that they rely on.
Right. So you also spoke about the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. How does that work exactly, and how is it working in the middle of this pandemic?
So the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program is one of the main streams of temporary foreign work that Canada relies on to staff its agricultural industry. It's absolutely crucial to our agricultural industry's ability to survive. Upwards of 30,000 seasonal agricultural workers come to Canada every year. They can stay in Canada for 8 months of the year working, and that, again, is on a temporary basis. So despite the fact that many workers live and work in Canada for 8 months a year for their entire adult lives, they are not able to gain permanent residency status and stay longer than the 8 months prescribed by the program.
So they're basically living in limbo.
Yeah, and this has long, prior to the pandemic, been a source of tension because what the actual structure of the program does is tie workers' right to be in Canada essentially to a single employer. So they only get to come to Canada and work and earn this income to send home if they are called back to the farm that they are working on. It's essentially a tied work permit. For example, they speak up about problems with living or working conditions on that farm. They risk being sent back to their country and potentially being ejected from the program. So unlike most people working in Canada who can leave an abusive job and seek work elsewhere, most migrant workers do not effectively have that ability. They are tied to one workplace.
Right. And also migrant worker advocates have been talking about for a long time about the working and living standards on some Canadian farms for seasonal laborers. Is this putting them at greater risk of contracting the virus in this current situation?
Yeah, I mean, again, these are longstanding problems that I think the pandemic is really highlighting. Seasonal agricultural workers live in bunkhouses and accommodation that are provided by their employer. Often it's on site at the farm. There are really long-standing issues with the quality of that accommodation. And I did an investigation last year where we looked into the complaints that are being made by Mexican migrant workers. Mexican workers are the biggest proportion of workers that come work on Canadian farms. And we found thousands of complaints that have been made about living and working conditions to the Mexican authorities, most of which are not shared with Canadian enforcement officials. And housing was the number one issue: cramped living conditions, unsanitary living conditions. I visited numerous bunkhouses, one of which I counted over 100 beds in a single house. So you can imagine in the middle of a pandemic where we are supposed to be social distancing, the health risks that can potentially pose.
You also recently reported on this. There's some kind of waivers that the Jamaican government in particular is making migrant farm workers sign. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so I learned this week that Jamaican migrant workers are being made to sign waivers prior to leaving for Canada that essentially releases the Jamaican government of any liability that stems from exposure to COVID-19. Really, I think the message that workers told me they're receiving is that they're on their own when they get to Canada. If they incur costs or, long-term damage as a result of falling ill with the virus, the Jamaican government is saying we're not responsible. And I think that's combined with a concern over lack of training and preparation. The workers that I spoke to said, they really haven't received very much information on how to keep themselves safe. In many cases, obviously, they're living in situations where it's impossible to social distance. They're sharing bedrooms, they're sharing kitchens with numerous other workers. I think it's quite an isolating experience for a lot of those workers. They are able, because they pay tax on their wages, they are entitled when they're in Canada to OHIP if they're in Ontario. So they can use the Ontario health system to access free care. But again, last year in investigating the sort of systemic problems that these workers face, medical neglect was a huge one. Many workers complaining that they would fall ill and ask to go to the doctor, and their employer would refuse to take them or delay taking them, sometimes for hours and sometimes with life-threatening consequences. I think that even when there are rights on paper, a lot of workers speak of struggling to access those rights.
I know you've been reporting on this and you spoke to some of these workers who are probably under a lot of pressure to not be able to speak out and talk about what's going on. What did they say that they need right now?
I think that the single biggest tool to fix this problem, not just during the pandemic, but long-term, is permanent residency status. Many workers' advocates' perspective and workers themselves provide the kind of security that would allow them to speak up if they don't feel safe. I mean, even from employers' perspective, it would provide, more stability in terms of staffing their farms. I think it would, from workers' perspective, give them a much stronger ability to speak up and access the rights that do exist on paper. I think in the shorter term, information and training that is accessible is key for a lot of workers. Training that happens in their own language with folks who are trusted and can be turned to in a crisis. Another issue is that the sending countries, Mexico, Jamaica, et cetera, they all have liaison offices in Canada that are there to assist workers who are in trouble or feel unsafe. But there's this huge pressure to keep sending workers. These countries rely on the remittances. And if Canada decides we're not happy with our relationship with Mexico or whoever, the employers can just turn to another country and select their workers from that country. And so there's a lot of downward pressure on workers from their own liaison officers to kind of not complain and not rock the boat. So we think making sure that there is a real kind of support system for workers in the middle of this pandemic is seen as something that's really important.
And what about the role of our government? We know that there was an announcement of a $50 million program to cover the cost of quarantine for workers, basically, when they arrive, which is about $1,500 per worker for their accommodation and wages and other costs. How are people still falling through the cracks?
Well, I think that the $1,500 goes some way toward, or it is meant to go some way toward offsetting some of the costs that employers are going to have to shoulder to deal with the self-quarantining protocols. So all of the workers that are arriving now are basically being put up in hotels, et cetera, so that they can do their quarantining for 2 weeks before starting work. And obviously that comes at a cost. And so that is what the money is meant to offset. But it doesn't fix the long-term problems of, when they're done with their 2 weeks quarantining, where are they going to go live? Are they going to live in accommodation where they each have their own room, or are they going to be sharing rooms with multiple other workers, for example? So one thing that advocates are calling for is a national housing standard for migrant workers, stronger enforcement to make sure that living and working conditions are in compliance with public health standards, labor standards, et cetera. I think there are some question marks over whether the $1,500 per worker is enough to actually deal with the root of these issues.
And also, there isn't any kind of federal oversight at the moment, is there? This money is given to employers or industry organizations to actually implement these safety measures and look after the basic rights of these workers. And it seems to me like they've just left the bulk of the responsibility to the employers for the workers' well-being. Is that a correct perception?
Well, I think what we've been told is that getting the $1,500 is contingent on employers complying with public health requirements. And we've been told that public health units are going to be increasing their inspections to make sure that compliance is there. From what I understand, there will be targeted inspections on farms, which happens anyway, but even when there's not a pandemic and when employers aren't getting $1,500 per worker. But sort of the longstanding issue is that there's not enough inspection. So I'm still waiting for data from the federal government. I asked them this week, how many inspections are you conducting? Because last year, only a fraction of employers who use temporary foreign workers were actually the subject of a targeted inspection. So I think that data is really important, and we don't know to what extent and to what scale there will be enforcement.
And there's been increasing cases of infections already. We know there was a major outbreak at a Kelowna nursery. Was just waiting to happen considering the conditions that these workers are forced to live in that you're talking to me about?
I think it's a real concern. Worker advocates are definitely warning that migrant workers are particularly vulnerable. And I think we're seeing that more broadly with who is being impacted. Obviously, no matter what your social standing, you are at risk of contracting this virus, but you are at greater risk if you are low income and living in cramped housing, or you're a frontline worker who are often low-wage workers. You may be at greater risk if you don't feel you can seek medical attention in a timely way. And again, that is a long-standing issue for migrant workers based on what we've found in our investigations. I think it's a real concern. And I think that the other concern is that the response to those fears over the particular vulnerability of migrant workers is going to take on something of a racial tinge. There have already been local news reports, for example, in Niagara now, that some stores in the region are refusing entry to migrant workers. And at the end of the day, these workers still need to be out in the community, they have to get food. They need to, they need to be able to buy groceries or go to the doctor if they need to. I spoke to one worker this week who said they've essentially been told if they leave their bunkhouse, they risk suspension from work. There are fears over spreading the virus, but Canadian residents are not being told you can't even leave your home to do your groceries, even if you're not displaying any symptoms and aren't a known health risk. So I think there are fears that the response in particular toward migrant workers will take on a bit of a racially charged tinge.
Is what's going on during this pandemic also highlighting the bigger issue here, which you've been talking about, some of the structural issues that exist on farms across Canada and also these deep inequities that you're talking about?
I definitely think so. I think there are real concerns over the structure of the migrant worker program, which has essentially not changed for decades and is really predicated on low-wage, extremely vulnerable workers who often have really no choice in their home country. I spent weeks last year living with and interviewing migrant workers in their home countries in Mexico. And they're people who are often in really rural, disenfranchised parts of the country that have been deeply impacted by cartel violence and have very few options. Obviously, yes, it's great to be able to have a source of income in Canada, but they're coming here with a huge degree of power imbalance. They have no stable immigration status. They're here alone without their families. They can be sent back home really for almost no reason. They don't speak the language. Sometimes they don't even speak Spanish as a first language. They come from Indigenous communities and don't speak Spanish as a mother tongue. And so there are sort of small outlets of protection. For example, the Liberal government passed a new program last year where workers can speak up about abuse and potentially get an open work permit. But, for example, you have to file a complaint in English or French, and you have to have access to a computer. It's all online. And so structurally, these things are really difficult for migrant workers to access. And I think they do very little, again, to address the real deep power imbalances that are kind of baked into the program. And I think the pandemic is really throwing that into harsh relief.
I think it's highlighting for a lot of Canadians exactly how vulnerable and precariously positioned migrant workers are, who basically have no choice but to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And also how dependent we are. It's a permanent need that their work is so needed in our country. They are producing the most essential good, but the program in many ways is disempowering and does not accord the same rights that, any other worker in Canada would expect on the job. And I think that because these workers are being drawn from, very low income countries, there's sort of this narrative of, well, they're grateful for the work. And that is true on one level, but I think we often gloss over that lack of choice and the lack of power and the lack of rights that any other worker in Canada would expect. And I think it's important to query why that is happening.
Thank you for joining me on the podcast, Sara.
Thank you.
That was Sara Mojtehedzadeh, the Toronto Star's work and wealth reporter. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Muther. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by SoCalled, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.